This is On the Line, and I'm Eric Felton. With the global economic downturn, the number of child laborers has gone down slightly over the last few years, but more than 200 million children are still engaged in jobs that are either dangerous or that keep them from going to school and getting an education. What can be done to reduce child labor? I'll ask my guest, Kevin Cassidy. He's with the United Nations International Labor Organization, and he joins us from New York. Welcome.
Thank you, Eric.
So Kevin, let's say there's someone has a farm and his kids help with harvest. I think most people would see that as a legitimate pitching in for the family enterprise. And where do you draw the line between work that it's sort of okay for kids to be involved in and what counts as the kind of child labor that the International Labor Organization is really trying to do something about?
There are international standards that differentiate between light work and work that's acceptable for children underage, and we make that dividing line at 18. So when we talk about child labor, we're talking about children between 5 and 17 years of age. Work on family farms is normally excluded from these international conventions and national legislation, and I believe the U.S. Department of Labor has its own set of rules. But we're talking about work that puts children at hazard, that interferes with their education, with their development. If children are working on a farm, of course, they're exposed to pesticides, they're exposed to illnesses such as green tobacco disease, or they're exposed to heavy machinery, which, if improperly used, may cause damage. So there is a dividing line, and I think it's not hard and fast, but usually family farms are normally excluded, although agriculture is the biggest area of concern for the ILO in terms of child labor.
And where are the most child laborers in the world? Is this something that is in particular regions, or is it worldwide?
Unfortunately, child labor exists in every region and in every country. It sometimes is hidden, so it's hard to find exactly where it exists. But to give you an idea, there are 215 million child laborers, and of that, 115 million are in the worst forms. This is in trafficking, whether it be in drugs or in forced sexual exploitation. It could be in very hazardous jobs in working with heavy machinery or heat or underground. So there are a number of issues that we need to address, and again, it's not as cut and dry, but if we look at, say, sub-Saharan Africa, 28% of the instances of child labor exists there, about 18% in Asia and Pacific, and for a number of other countries, North America and Europe, there are still instances of child labor.
Do you find that children are being put to work and it's keeping them from going to schools that were otherwise available, or is it more that they don't have the opportunity for schooling, there aren't schools available, and so they end up working? Does one cause the other?
There are a lot of causes for child labor. Social exclusion and poverty certainly are the cause, but also the consequence of child labor. Education, I'm glad you brought that up, because education is an important way to address child labor. If there is good quality education available to children, this is what we seek, and we work with national institutions, with the governments, to ensure that quality education is provided. And of course, compulsory education is different from country to country, but normally, again, comes up to the age of about 17 years of age. So it's a very difficult task, because, as you rightly point out, that the poverty will drive them, because families are not going to sit around and starve. They're going to have to mobilize all the assets that they have, and in some cases the only asset they have are the children in the family.
How does child labor affect boys and girls differently? Are there different kinds of work that boys and girls are put into?
Yes, we find that mostly the boys are in industry. They're working with heavy machines. They're doing very physically demanding work. We find that girls are in the services industry, so that means that they're in domestic work, that they're in a number of instances, say, they're begging at a hotel, or they're selling goods on the street. So there is a little bit of a difference between the type of work between what boys and girls are doing. But the end result is that it is impeding their development emotionally, physically, and denying them an education. And this is not just a moral issue. This is an economic and political issue, because an illiterate, innumerate child will grow up to be an illiterate, innumerate adult, which will not be able to contribute their full potential to society, so that economy will stay depressed. And if you have people who are not getting jobs because they don't have the skills, thereby creating youth unemployment problems, as we see with the manifestations in the Arab Spring, where young people aren't able to get gainful employment, it sometimes explodes onto the political scene as well.
And how much does it contribute to other related problems, the sex trafficking problem of girls who are put into situations that lead them to being exploited?
You know, the sexual exploitation is probably the worst form of the hazardous forms of child labor and of anybody's experience in the world. We start now getting into issues of trafficking for sexual exploitation. This is not the largest part of child labor, although I think in many instances it's the most horrific, so people sort of grab onto that. Trafficking of human beings for sexual exploitation exists not only for children but also for adults as well. So we start to see how this creeps from childhood into adulthood and then creates these sort of unacceptable problems around the world. So we have to work with national entities because these are international problems. We have to make sure that there are penalties in place, that law enforcement officials are properly trained, that the perpetrators are actually prosecuted on this, that the laws exist so that they can be incarcerated for those crimes that they commit against children and against adults.
How big a problem is this for international corporations that are doing business all around the world and are, trying to live up to proper standards, but have difficulty in maintaining what their subcontractors may be doing in the production of goods around the world?
I mean, child labor does creep into the global value chain of companies, but not as much as maybe people would think so. 66% of all child labor is unpaid work in family businesses. This could be on a farm, this could be in a retail store, this could be in a home-based industry itself. So about 21% of children who are working, who should be in school, are in paid employment. And we see that in the informal economy. We see that in subcontractors or subcontractors, where there's very little law enforcement, that the labor inspectors aren't able to go into those areas. So it is not a huge problem, but we do see industries like cotton, like coffee, like cocoa, like sugar. These are industries which child labor has creeped into, and we have to be very vigilant to ensure that it doesn't expand further. And most of the big companies are sympathetic towards this, and they work with us because it is in their interest to ensure that their reputation is not besmirched by the taint of child labor.
Now, is the problem that there aren't enough laws on the books, or just the difficulty of enforcing the laws worldwide on child labor?
I think enforcement is probably one of the issues, and of course global awareness. I think many people are not aware of the extent of child labor and what constitutes child labor. So, for example, we have to develop these policies that take into account the economic development. It's not to say that because a country is underdeveloped they should not strive to eliminate child labor, but you're not going to want to further impoverish people. We look at countries, say, in sub-Saharan Africa, where, say, AIDS orphans who are living with a grandparent, maybe there are 5, maybe there are 10, maybe there are 15 children who have been left to the care of an older person who is no longer in the workforce. So some children will go to work and some children will go to school. Disproportionately, young girls are the ones who fall into forced labor because they're not necessarily considered ones who should have the education, because it is in some cultures, that the boys should actually have the opportunity for higher education. So it is sometimes the misuse of a cultural custom. Sometimes it's just the lack of access to quality education, or the lack of the finances to provide for education, but also these disasters. It could be conflict, where children are being sort of pressed into forced labor for armed conflict. So it manifests itself in many ways, and we have to not only look at the legislative frameworks, which are robust and which are ratified by most. Our conventions on this have been ratified by most countries, but it is the enforcement of that. It is the training of the law enforcement officials and the judges and the prosecutors on the human rights of the individual.
We only have a moment or two left, but the International Labor Organization has goals for eliminating child labor. What's your prospect at this point for how much of child labor you're going to be able to reduce?
In the beginning, you mentioned about the child labor decreasing, which is very true. Since the year 2000, we have seen 20 million children being taken out of child labor. However, over the last few years, and due to a financial economic crisis, which has caused pressure on many countries, we've seen that rate of reduction slowing down. Our goal was to eliminate child labor by 2016. Unfortunately, our trends show that we will not reach that goal. However, I think we've been very successful in achieving a modicum of awareness of this. We are working with civil society. We are working with a number of groups to raise awareness of these issues, to promote the benefits of eliminating child labor. Again, it is an economic issue and a political issue, so we want to ensure that child labor is tackled as best as possible, and it requires everyone's help, from governments to civil society to schools and to consumers.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. Kevin Cassidy is with the International Labor Organization at the United Nations. Thanks so much for joining us. Before we go, I'd like to invite you to send us your questions or comments. You can reach us through our website at voanews.com/ontheline. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you'll join us again next week for On the Line.